January 14, 1945. Luzon, Philippines. 0547 hours. The jungle breathes before dawn. Moisture hangs in the air like a living thing, clinging to leaves the size of dinner plates, dripping from vines that coil around mahogany trunks older than empire. In the half-light, the forest floor is a carpet of rot and renewal, fallen fronds dissolving into black soil, fungus blooming white as bone on deadwood. The temperature sits at 78 degrees, but it feels hotter, the humidity a wet hand pressing against every surface. Somewhere in the canopy, a hornbill calls out, its voice harsh and prehistoric. Then silence. The kind of silence that precedes violence. 300 yards to the east, Sergeant Hideki Yamamoto of the Imperial Japanese Army's 105th Division presses his spine against the corrugated bark of a nara tree. His uniform, once the color of dried tea, is now stained nearly black with mud and sweat. He has not changed clothes in 43 days. The rice ration that morning was a handful, maybe 3 ounces, mixed with weevils that he no longer bothers to pick out. Protein is protein when you are starving. His Type 38 rifle, inherited from a dead comrade in November, rests across his knees. 6 rounds in the magazine. He knows because he has counted them 11 times since midnight. Around him, 19 men occupy a defensive position scratched into the hillside, a network of foxholes connected by crawl trenches, camouflaged with palm fronds and artillery netting salvaged from a destroyed supply depot. They have been holding this position for 8 days, waiting for reinforcements that will never come, guarding a supply route that no longer exists. Yamamoto does not know this yet. What he knows is that the Americans are coming. He can feel it the way animals sense earthquakes. He adjusts his grip on the rifle and thinks, briefly, of Yokohama. Of his mother's kitchen. Of mackerel grilled over charcoal, the skin crackling, fat dripping into the fire with small hisses of blue flame. The memory is so vivid he can taste salt. Then it evaporates, replaced by the copper taste of fear at the back of his throat. The sound reaches them first. Not the crack of infantry rifles or the whistle of artillery, but something else. Something mechanical and deep. A rumbling that seems to come from the earth itself, felt in the chest before it registers in the ears. Yamamoto's head snaps up. The men around him freeze, eyes wide, straining to identify the source. The jungle amplifies and distorts sound. What seems close might be a mile away, what seems distant might be upon you. But this sound grows louder, steadier. The grinding of metal on metal. The cough and roar of heavy engines laboring through dense terrain. Then the trees begin to die. 20 yards ahead, a coconut palm shudders, its trunk splintering with a sound like a rifle shot. The tree leans, hesitates, then crashes sideways into the undergrowth. Another tree follows. Then another. Something is pushing through the jungle, something that does not care about the forest, that treats 100-year-old trees like tall grass. The sound intensifies, a mechanical scream of steel treads chewing through root and stone, engines bellowing, the whole mass advancing with inexorable momentum. Yamamoto has heard tanks before. He saw Type 95 Hagos in China, light tanks that clattered and wheezed and broke down in the heat. He knows the sound of American Shermans from intelligence briefings, the dependable rumble of their engines. But this is different. This sound is deeper. Angrier. The first one emerges from the tree line like a vision from a fever dream. It is massive, wider and lower than a Sherman, painted in mottled green and brown, its hull bristling with armor plates welded at angles. But what freezes Yamamoto's blood is not the tank itself. It is what extends from the front, a long, blunt nozzle, thick as a man's thigh, mounted on a swivel housing that looks obscenely mechanical, almost organic, like the proboscis of some steel insect. Even in the dim morning light, he can see the scorch marks around the nozzle's mouth, black carbon staining that speaks of tremendous heat. Behind the first machine, a second appears. Then a third. They advance in a staggered line, engines growling, treads throwing up great clods of earth. Infantry moves between them, American soldiers in herringbone twill utilities, helmets low, rifles ready, using the tanks as moving walls. Yamamoto does not know the designation. He does not know that these are M4A3 R3 Sherman tanks, specially modified with the Canadian Ronson flamethrower system, colloquially called Zippos by the men who crew them. He does not know that each tank carries 300 gallons of thickened fuel, a mixture of gasoline and napalm, or that the main flame gun can project a jet of burning gel up to 150 yards. He does not know that the U.S. Army converted 74 Sherman tanks to this configuration specifically for the Pacific Theater, where Japanese defensive positions in caves and bunkers proved nearly immune to conventional artillery. He does not know that the crews who operate these machines have a life expectancy measured in days once deployed to the front, because enemy soldiers target flamethrower tanks with suicidal determination, knowing that a single well-placed shot can turn the vehicle into a fireball that incinerates everyone inside. All Yamamoto knows is terror. The lead tank stops 30 yards from the Japanese position. The turret traverses slowly, the flame nozzle sweeping left to right like the head of a predator sampling the air. Yamamoto can hear his own breathing, ragged and too fast. Beside him, Private Sato begins to murmur a prayer, voice cracking. The Americans have seen them. They must have. The tank's engine idles with a deep, patient rumble. Somewhere behind the Japanese lines, a man breaks. Corporal Ito, youngest of the squad at 19, scrambles from his foxhole and runs. He makes it 4 steps before the flamethrower fires. The sound is not an explosion. It is a roar, a throaty cough followed by a sustained rushing noise like wind through a canyon. What emerges from the nozzle is not fire as Yamamoto understands fire. It is a liquid sun, a stream of orange and yellow and white that arcs through the air in a perfect parabola, droplets of burning gel separating from the main jet, trailing smoke. The stream strikes Corporal Ito in the back and envelopes him completely. For perhaps half a second, Yamamoto sees the boy's silhouette inside the flame, arms outstretched, mouth open. Then the silhouette is gone, consumed, and what falls to the ground is something that no longer resembles a human being. The flame jet continues, sweeping right, igniting the foxholes. Men scream. Not the sharp cry of bullet wounds, but something worse, animal sounds, wordless and high. The flame clings to everything it touches. Sandbags erupt into torches. Wooden support beams explode into splinters of fire. The earth itself seems to burn, the flame burrowing into the soil, igniting roots and humus, creating secondary fires that spread with terrifying speed. The heat is unbearable even at 30 yards. Yamamoto feels his skin tightening, the air in his lungs turning hot and thin. The smell is worse than the heat, burning gasoline mixed with something organic and sweet and utterly wrong. He runs. There is no decision involved. The body simply moves, survival instinct overriding discipline, loyalty, shame. He crashes through the undergrowth, branches lashing his face, boots slipping on wet leaves. Behind him, the roar of the flamethrower continues, punctuated now by the crack of rifle fire and the deeper boom of the tank's main gun. He does not look back. He runs until his lungs burn, until his legs turn to rubber, until he collides with a tree trunk and falls, gasping, into a drainage ditch half filled with stagnant water. He lies there, face pressed into mud that smells of decay, body shaking with exhaustion and shock, while the battle continues somewhere behind him. Eventually, the sounds fade. The jungle reclaims its silence. Yamamoto survived that morning. 12,000 others did not. To understand the weapon that broke Hideki Yamamoto, you must first understand the problem it was designed to solve. By January 1945, the American advance across the Pacific had assumed the characteristics of a grim, methodical industrial process. Island by island, the United States moved westward, each campaign a study in coordinated violence, naval bombardment followed by amphibious assault, close air support, infantry pushing inland through terrain that seemed designed by a malicious god to maximize casualties. The Japanese did not simply defend these islands. They transformed them into fortresses, turning natural caves into machine gun nests, digging tunnels that connected defensive positions into subterranean networks, creating interlocking fields of fire where every approach was covered by multiple weapons. They did not retreat. They did not surrender. They fought from prepared positions until killed, then the next man took up the position, and the next, in a cycle that consumed divisions. Conventional tactics faltered against this defense. Artillery bombardment, no matter how intensive, could not collapse tunnels dug 30 feet into solid rock. Naval guns firing from offshore could destroy surface structures but left cave systems intact. Infantry assaults became killing operations where American soldiers, advancing across open ground, were cut down by defenders firing from positions that were nearly invisible and almost indestructible. The mathematics were brutal. On Peleliu, a tiny coral island in the Palau chain, A single Japanese regiment of 10,000 men held out for more than 2 months against an entire American division. The cave systems were so extensive that some defenders remained hidden for weeks after the island was declared secured, emerging at night to raid supply dumps before vanishing underground. The casualty rates horrified commanders who had grown accustomed to losses in Europe but found the Pacific theater uniquely unforgiving. Engineers proposed solutions. Satchel charges of TNT could be thrown into cave mouths, but this required soldiers to approach within yards of the opening, exposed to point-blank fire. Bazookas and recoilless rifles could sometimes collapse tunnels, but the shaped charges often penetrated too far before detonating, spending their force deep in the rock rather than destroying the entrance. Flamethrowers, the man-portable type carried by specially trained infantry, worked, but the operators had to close to within 50 feet of the target, and the tanks they wore on their backs made them priority targets for every Japanese rifleman within range. The life expectancy of a flamethrower operator in combat was measured in minutes. Something else was needed. Something with the range to engage from a safe distance, the fuel capacity to sustain fire, and the armor to survive while doing so. The answer came from a direction military planners rarely looked: the civilian fire department. In 1943, engineers at the U.S. Army's Chemical Warfare Service began experimenting with tank-mounted flamethrowers, adapting systems originally developed for industrial fire control. The concept was simple: mount a large-capacity fuel tank and pressurized projection system onto a Sherman tank, replacing the bow machine gun with a flame nozzle. Early prototypes were disastrous. The fuel ignited prematurely, incinerating test crews. The pump systems failed under sustained use. The nozzles clogged or ruptured. But the engineers persisted, refining the design through hundreds of tests, gradually solving each failure point. By late 1944, they had a working system. The M4A3R3 carried its napalm fuel in 2 armored tanks mounted inside the hull, fed by a compressed nitrogen system that could project the thickened fuel at high velocity. The flame gun itself was electrically fired, eliminating the ignition failures of earlier designs. Most importantly, the system could operate for sustained periods, up to 40 individual bursts before depleting its fuel supply, giving the tank genuine tactical endurance rather than being a single-use weapon. The first flame tanks arrived in the Pacific in December 1944, just as American forces prepared for the invasion of Luzon, largest of the Philippine Islands and the site of Manila, the archipelago's capital. Intelligence reports indicated that General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding Japanese forces in the Philippines, had fortified the island with more than 260,000 troops, many positioned in mountainous terrain honeycombed with caves and prepared defenses. The Americans expected another bloodbath. They were not wrong, but the flame tanks would alter the equation in ways no one fully anticipated. The Japanese soldiers waiting in those mountains expected many things. They expected American artillery, having endured it before. They expected airstrikes and naval bombardment, the impersonal violence of machines destroying from altitude and distance. They expected infantry assaults, the close-quarters savagery of rifle and grenade and bayonet. They did not expect hell to become portable. In the Japanese military culture of 1945, death in battle was not merely accepted but valorized, woven into the fabric of training and indoctrination with such thoroughness that the line between duty and suicide had become philosophical rather than practical. The concept of gyokusai, shattering like a jewel, elevated battlefield death to spiritual apotheosis, positioning surrender not as a tactical option but as a moral failure worse than death itself. Soldiers received extensive training in close combat tactics designed not to survive but to inflict maximum damage before inevitable death. They practiced bayonet charges, bonsai attacks, the operation of suicide demolition charges. They were told, repeatedly and from every level of command, that capture meant torture and execution, that American soldiers routinely murdered prisoners, that defeat would bring dishonor not only to the individual but to his family, his village, his ancestors stretching back generations. This was not mere propaganda. It was a comprehensive restructuring of the psyche, a rewiring of survival instinct to embrace death as the highest expression of loyalty. But flamethrower tanks introduced something that ideology could not prepare them for. Humans can steel themselves against bullets, can accept the randomness of shrapnel, can even embrace the intimacy of bayonet combat as a final test of martial spirit. Fire is different. Fire is ancient and primal, coded into human consciousness at a level that precedes culture and language. The fear of burning is not rational. It is instinctive, cellular, The same fear that made our ancestors flee forest fires and worship the sun as a god. When that fire comes not from the sky but from a machine that walks toward you with mechanical indifference, when it clings to flesh and burns underwater and cannot be extinguished by rolling on the ground, something breaks. Lieutenant Masao Nakamura, interviewed after the war by Allied intelligence officers, described the first time he saw a flame tank in action. His unit, dug into positions outside the town of San Manuel, had prepared for weeks. They had fields of fire measured and marked. They had stockpiled ammunition and positioned heavy machine guns to create crossfire zones that would shred any infantry assault. They had explosives buried in the road, command detonated to destroy American armor. They were confident. Then the flame tanks arrived. "We opened fire when they were 200 meters away," Nakamura recalled in his deposition, recorded March 1946. "Our machine guns hit them many times. We could see the bullets strike the armor and ricochet away. It did nothing. They kept coming. Then they stopped, and the flame came. It was like watching the sun fall to earth. I saw Sergeant Kimura, a man I had known for 3 years, who had survived China and Guadalcanal. I saw him catch fire and run. He ran in circles, screaming, beating at his body, but the flame would not go out. It burned brighter when he tried to smother it. After that, I could not make my men stay in their positions. They would face bullets. They would face tanks. But not the fire. Not that." The psychological effect cascaded through Japanese defensive lines faster than the tactical impact. Word spread from unit to unit, carried by runners and survivors, exaggerated in the telling but rooted in genuine horror. American units discovered entire defensive positions abandoned, foxholes and bunkers left intact, weapons still in place, the defenders simply gone, fled into the jungle rather than face the flame tanks. Prisoners, when they could be convinced to speak, described a collapse of cohesion, of soldiers who had been indoctrinated to die before surrendering now choosing to run, to hide, to survive by any means rather than burn. Intelligence officers noted the phenomenon but struggled to quantify it. How do you measure fear? How do you count the defensive positions that never fired because the defenders had already left? The flame tanks themselves were miserable to crew. Inside the hull, temperatures regularly exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit, the heat radiating from the fuel tanks and the sun-baked steel turning the crew compartment into an oven. The men operated in a state of constant, low-level heat exhaustion, drinking water by the gallon, salt tablets consumed like candy. The noise was overwhelming, the roar of the engine, the hydraulic whine of the turret traverse, the explosive cough of the flame gun firing, all contained within an armored box that amplified sound until crews suffered permanent hearing damage after a few weeks of operation. And always, underneath everything, was the knowledge of what they carried. 300 gallons of napalm, pressurized, one armor-piercing round away from turning the tank into a crematorium for its crew. They smoked cigarettes inside the tank, despite regulations prohibiting it, because the absurdity of worrying about fire safety while sitting on a bomb of jellied gasoline was too much to bear. Sergeant Michael DiCarlo, flame tank operator with the 713th Tank Battalion, kept a journal throughout the Luzon campaign. His entry from January 28, 1945, describes the aftermath of an engagement near Bamban. "We hit a position in the hills today. Caves, maybe 15 or 20 of them, cut into the ridgeline. Regular shells had been bouncing off for 2 days. They sent us up. I don't like to write about what the flame does, but I'm going to because maybe someday someone should know. When you fire, you can see the caves light up from inside. Like someone turned on a lamp in a room, except the light is orange and it flickers. You can hear the screaming even over the engine noise. Sometimes they run out, burning, and you have to watch them. Sometimes they don't come out at all, and later the infantry goes in and finds them. I threw up after. Charlie said I'd get used to it. I don't want to get used to it. But effective. God, was it effective?" By February 1945, American forces had advanced 130 miles across Luzon in 6 weeks, a rate of progress unthinkable in previous campaigns. The flame tanks, operating in conjunction with infantry and conventional armor, had become the preferred solution for reducing fortified positions. The tactical doctrine evolved rapidly: locate a defensive position through reconnaissance, isolate it with infantry cordons to prevent escape or reinforcement, then bring up the flame tanks to systematically burn out each cave, bunker, and foxhole. The process was thorough, brutal, and devastatingly effective. Japanese casualty rates spiked. American casualties dropped. The mathematics of war shifted. There is an object that appears repeatedly in American military photographs from the Pacific Theater, so common as to be almost invisible: the sea ration can. Specifically, the M1942 field ration, a collection of 6 12-ounce cans containing various combinations of meat, bread, and accessory items, designed to provide a soldier with 3,000 calories per day in a format that could survive tropical heat, humidity, and rough handling. The rations were universally despised. Soldiers complained about the monotony, the excessive grease, the way the meat and vegetable hash tasted like dog food, but they were ubiquitous and abundant. A soldier in the field could expect 3 hot meals a day when circumstances allowed, supplemented by rations when they did not, with additional supplies of coffee, sugar, cigarettes, and chocolate routinely distributed. Medical care was immediate and sophisticated, with morphine and sulfa drugs available at the company level, surgical teams operating within miles of the front, and evacuation chains that could move a wounded man from the battlefield to a hospital ship in hours. It shattered the narrative they had been taught about American weakness. An enemy that brings fire to war, that burns caves and bunkers without hesitation, that treats fortified positions as obstacles to be incinerated rather than assaulted, that enemy is not soft. That enemy is terrifying. Nakamura, in his post-war testimony, said something that Allied intelligence officers noted but did not fully understand at the time. After we saw the flame tanks, we knew the war was lost. Not because we could not win battles, but because we were fighting an enemy that did not fight the way men fight. They fought like gods, like forces of nature. You cannot defeat a volcano with courage. The symbolism was clear to anyone who cared to see it. The flame represented not just a weapon but a philosophy, the application of overwhelming force to eliminate problems rather than endure them. Where Japanese doctrine emphasized perseverance through suffering, American doctrine emphasized the use of material superiority to minimize suffering for its own soldiers, even if that meant inflicting spectacular suffering on the enemy. It was a collision of ideologies made manifest in napalm and steel. By April 1945, organized Japanese resistance on Luzon had collapsed into isolated pockets. Yamashita, the vaunted tiger of Malaya, had withdrawn into the mountains with the remnants of his command, abandoning Manila to American forces and condemning the city to urban warfare that would kill over 100,000 civilians. The flame tanks had been instrumental in reducing Japanese positions throughout the campaign, but their psychological impact extended beyond the battles they fought. Soldiers who never saw a flame tank, who fought hundreds of miles from where they operated, still knew about them. The knowledge spread like the fire itself. You cannot hide from it, it burns everything, there is no defense. Morale, already strained by starvation and isolation, crumbled further. The Americans noticed. Intelligence reports began documenting increased surrender rates in areas where flame tanks had operated, not immediately but in the weeks following. The presence of the weapon seemed to create a delayed psychological effect, a realization settling in among surviving Japanese soldiers that further resistance was not heroic but simply prolonged suicide. Some units held out until the official Japanese surrender in August. Others melted away into the jungle, living as fugitives, emerging years later, hollow-eyed and skeletal, still carrying rifles they no longer remembered how to use. The flame tanks themselves were withdrawn from service relatively quickly after the war ended. The M4A3R3 proved too specialized, too maintenance-intensive, too psychologically devastating to crew for extended periods. The Army converted most of them back to standard Shermans, stripping out the flamethrower systems and restoring the bow machine guns. A few were kept for training purposes. Several ended up in museums. DeCarlo's tank, which had carried the nickname Zippo stenciled on the turret, was scrapped in 1947, cut apart for metal that probably ended up in automobiles or refrigerators, the steel recycled into the machinery of peace. But the doctrine survived. The principle that American forces would use fire to solve problems that other armies would assault with infantry became codified in military planning. Napalm bombs dropped from aircraft became standard in Korea, then Vietnam. Flamethrowers, both man-portable and vehicle-mounted, remained part of the arsenal for decades. The calculus was brutal but simple. American lives were more valuable than enemy lives, and any weapon that reduced American casualties was justified, regardless of its effects on the enemy. This was not unique to America. Every military makes the same calculation, but the industrial capacity to implement it on a massive scale was. The Japanese soldiers who survived the war and returned home carried the memories of the flame with them. Yamamoto lived until 1983, working as a postal clerk in Yokohama. He seldom spoke about the war. His children knew he had served, knew he had been in the Philippines, but he never described combat. Near the end of his life, suffering from lung cancer and heavily medicated, he told his daughter about the morning the flame tanks came. She recorded his words, unsure whether they were memory or morphine hallucination. They did not fight like soldiers. They fought like fire itself. We were not defeated by men. We were defeated by machines that burned souls. There is poetry in that, even if it is the poetry of trauma. Because what Yamamoto had glimpsed, through the literal fire, was something more fundamental than tactics or weapons. He had seen the face of industrial total war, where victory goes not to the most courageous or most skilled, but to the side that can produce the most steel, deploy the most machines, deliver the most violence with the least risk to its own soldiers. The flame tank was not an aberration. It was the logical endpoint of a philosophy that valued efficiency over honor, overwhelming force over tactical elegance, victory over chivalry. And it worked. By every metric that mattered to military planners, the flame tanks were a success. They reduced fortifications that conventional weapons could not. They broke enemy morale. They saved American lives by killing the enemy from a distance, with minimal risk to the crews operating them. That the weapon was horrific, that it inflicted suffering of a particularly grotesque nature, was regrettable but beside the point. War is not a moral exercise. It is a problem to be solved, and the flame tanks solved it with ruthless efficiency. But efficiency has a cost that does not appear in after-action reports. DiCarlo, the tank operator who kept the journal, came home to Boston in December 1945. He married his high school sweetheart, had 3 children, worked as a machinist for 37 years. By all external measures, he was a success story of post-war adjustment. But his wife told a different story after he died. How he could not stand the smell of gasoline. How he refused to use the fireplace in their home. How he woke screaming from nightmares she was never allowed to ask about. How, near the end, when Alzheimer's had stripped away his inhibitions, he would weep and apologize to people who were not there, begging forgiveness for things he would not name. The fire burned more than Japanese soldiers. It burned the men who deployed it, left scars that could not be seen or treated, wounds carried silently because there was no language to describe them and no audience willing to listen. This, too, is part of the story, though it is rarely told. The flame tanks were effective because they were terrible. They broke the enemy because they were nightmare made real. And the men who operated them paid a price for that effectiveness, measured not in casualties but in pieces of the soul shaved away, one burnt cave at a time. In the end, what does the flame tank represent? Is it American ingenuity, the ability to identify a problem and engineer a solution? Is it industrial might, the capacity to deploy sophisticated weapons in quantities that overwhelm opposition? Or is it something darker, the willingness to unleash weapons of such horror that the enemy's courage becomes irrelevant, replaced by primal terror? Perhaps it is all of these things. Perhaps the flame tank is simply honest about what modern war requires. There is no glory in fire. There is no honor in burning men alive. But there is victory, purchased at the price of moral compromise, efficiency measured in enemy soldiers who ran rather than fought, in positions abandoned rather than defended. The Japanese soldier expected to die with honor. The flame tank gave him the choice between dying in agony or fleeing in shame. That most chose to flee is not cowardice. It is humanity's last rebellion against doctrines that demand the impossible. Yamamoto survived because he ran. Thousands of others died because they stayed. Neither decision was wrong. Both were human responses to an inhuman situation, to the collision of flesh and ideology with industrial warfare's fundamental truth, that in the end, abundance wins. The side with more tanks, more fuel, more food, more of everything grinds down opposition.